Okay, welcome back. It's time to study the Torah a little bit this morning, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to see today because I want you to kind of know what's going to happen. First, think back on what we've looked at so far. What we've seen so far has been basically God introducing himself to the people of Israel through Moses, and they are just now kind of getting to know one another. So far, the things have happened really fast. And I've asked you to kind of picture this as a movie in your head because I can't make the movie, obviously. I can barely make these videos any good. And so it's kind of, you have to just kind of picture this. So here's the thing. For me, it's the beginning of the first Indiana Jones movie. Whatever it is for you, but have you ever watched a movie and there's an action sequence where it happens really fast and all of a sudden, before you know it, you're caught up in the series of events? For me, that first Indiana Jones movie where he's going into that cave and he gets that little gold idol and a guy gets killed and another guy gets killed and the ball rolls down and he runs out of the thing, grabs his whip and falls out, and then the bad guys are all there, and then he manages to get away from them but without the idol, and he jumps into the airplane and he flies away, and then there's a big snake in the airplane. And then he's back at college teaching again. Well, that little sequence is, for me, what I picture. Whatever movie you like, you can insert here. But that little episode, that moment happens really quickly. And when it's over with, you go, oh man, that was just, wow, amazing, right? Now, this is what we've gone through so far. Moses sees a burning bush. The old man comes into town, says, "Hey, the bush told me to lead you people out." And then there's the plagues and the intensity with Pharaoh and the whole thing. And then the Passover, and the firstborn of everyone in Egypt dies. And in the middle of the night, the Egyptians say, "Get out of here," to the Israelites, and they leave and they take their stuff. They take Egyptian gold and all kinds of things with them, and which is amazing because nearly everything in Egypt has been destroyed by the plagues. And then they get out and they're just outside in the desert there being led around by this cloud and this weird old man and some strange god that they can't see. And then they get stopped and there's the army coming down after them, and good grief, now what? And then the ocean parts and they go right through the middle of the ocean in the middle of the night again. The day breaks, they sing a song of Moses, and whew, just a little burst of energy. And now what? Now what? Now we're standing around in the middle of a desert. Okay, what do we do at this point? It's just kind of weird. So what they're doing is they're doing what people do. They're getting up in the morning and packing up their tent and their stuff and getting the kids together and going across the desert. And that's where our story is today. What we're going to talk about is the first little bit of their travels as they are they've been through this whole Exodus experience, and now they're beginning to travel out through the desert. And I want you to picture what it would be like to all of a sudden, after all your whole life, your life has changed, and your life now consists of getting up, walking, stopping, making camp, going to bed, getting up, making your tent, and moving ahead. And the whole time, you don't really know where you're going. You kind of know, and you don't really know what you're doing, and there's nobody really in charge except the one old guy, and there's this God, and there's no religion yet or anything else. And so for a while it's just awkward and strange, and you don't really even know what's happening each day. That's looking at it from their perspective. Moses knows that God is using him to lead them from Egypt into the promised land, and he's just going to follow God's instructions, do what God tells him to do. And probably in Moses' mind, he's just thinking, okay, he believes in God. He may not like the job, but he believes God's going to do it, and he's going to lead these people over to where they're supposed to be. From God's perspective, it's different. God knows that he has to give these people a set of laws, that he is going to have to train them to learn to rely on him. Up until now, they're used to relying on Pharaoh and the Egyptians to provide them with their food and their clothing and their housing and all of the things that it takes to make life, because they were slaves, and so they've been dependent upon Egypt. Now God's training them to be dependent upon Him, not dependent upon themselves, or not dependent upon their own strength as warriors or as farmers or as brick makers, but now to be fully and completely reliant on God. And so how does God do that? Well, that's what we're going to see today. The training process is beginning, where God is teaching them, and He's being patient and a good teacher and sort of leading them through a series of experiences. The other thing that we'll get to towards the end is that God knows that this is going to be a lesson for all of us, for all time, that this is how God introduces Himself to us and where we learn to be reliant on God. There are 3 stories in today's episode. 3 stories. And they break down like this. I'm just going to run through the first one real quick. It is after this sort of introduction, they get up and they begin to wonder. Day 1, day 2, day 3. They get to day 3, and one of the little kids says, "I'm thirsty." And Dad says, "Be quiet." And the little kid says, "But I'm thirsty. I want some water." And Dad says, "We'll be there soon." "How much further, Dad, till we get to the water?" Then the mom says, "Why don't you give the girl some water?" And Dad says, "Well, we don't have any more water." "What do you mean we don't have any more water?" "Well, we're out of water. We've been out here for 3 days. How much water was I supposed to take?" "Well, you didn't bring enough." Then you hear the mom. She yells at the group next to him, "Mabel, do you have any water over there? My bonehead husband didn't bring enough." And then Mabel says, "No, we're out of water too." And pretty soon word spreads throughout the camp. Nobody's got any water. They're all out of water. And everybody says, "Don't worry about it. You know, we're supposed to be getting to someplace." Well, Moses says it this way. Moses says, after 3 days in the desert, they came to the place where there was supposed to be water, but the place's name is Marah, or Mara in Hebrew. M-A-R-A-H. Okay, so they get to Mara, but get this. You'd miss this in English. Mara means bitter. So when they get to the place that's supposed to have water, the place is called bitter. And so in Hebrew, I'll just translate it. Moses says this. He goes, "So after 3 days wandering, they came to bitter, but they couldn't drink the water because it was bitter, and that's why the place is called bitter, because the water's bitter." It's kind of Moses' way of saying, duh, what do you think we were going to have? So now can you imagine? Oh, grumbling and complaining and whining. "What are we going to do? You let us out here to die of thirst." So and now watch this, because you're going to see the same pattern happen again and again. You hit into a point where people do what people do. They're like, "What do we do now? We're out of water. We're dead. We're going to just sit here and die. And this water's bitter." Then they complain to Moses. Moses complains to God. You'll see the word grumble appear a lot in here. And pay attention to those kinds of things. All right. So then Yahweh tells Moses to take a hunk of wood, throw it in the water, and he does, and the water's sweet, and all of a sudden it's good tasting. And then God says this. Listen carefully. "If you listen carefully to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in His eyes, if you pay attention to His commands and keep all His decrees, I won't bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near water. Now, so that's a weird scene too, by the way. I mean, can you picture 2 million people camped around and there's 70 trees and 70? That would be kind of weird. Okay, so here's what I want you to see. Pay special attention now to what they did, because that's what we all do. You start out and you're like, is it unreasonable to complain at this point? Is it? No, it's just I'd complain too. 3 days without water, when you get there it's bitter. But Moses is kind of smart alecky, isn't he? Duh, that's why they call it bitter, you moron. But look what God says. God is sort of testing them. And look at what God says to them. He says, "Look, if you do these things, then I'll do these things. And there's your contract, there's your covenant, your testament. We call it Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant. This is an agreement made. God's saying, here's my job and here's what I'll do, and here's your job and here's what you do. And what God says is he doesn't say to them, if you dig a well 75 feet deep and 3 feet square, then you'll find water. God says, you do what I tell you to do. I'll take care of the water. That's hard for us humans to get our mind around. Okay, and our second of the three stories has to do with food. I mean, if after 3 days they ran out of water, guess what happens after 6 weeks? You guessed it. And you'll see the exact same pattern happen again. Now, as you look through this story, it occurs in Exodus chapter 16, if you want to read it. And I hope that you will read these stories on your own during the week. But what happens again is there are 6 weeks now since they've left Egypt. So about a month and a half. And they've been getting up every day, and God's taking care of their drink and all of that, but they've now eaten up all their food, and so what do? They begin grumbling. And they say, if we had only died by Yahweh's hand in Egypt, there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out to this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So they grumbled against Moses and Aaron, which is what they do. And then God answers this way. I'll rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I'll test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they're to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So then, Moses and Aaron say this to all the Israelites. Here's what they say, and listen carefully, because this is kind of cool the way Moses and Aaron talk to the people. Listen to this. In the evening, you will know that it was Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning, you'll see the glory of Yahweh, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? You'll know it was Yahweh when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against Yahweh. Say to the entire community, come before Yahweh, for he has heard you grumbling. And then the little note added on says this. Aaron was speaking to the assembly, and he looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of Yahweh appearing in the cloud. Now, consider what's actually happened here. All right, they ran out of food, and so they get mad at Moses and Aaron. Moses is talking to Aaron, and Aaron's doing the talking. And so God says, I'm going to provide you with food. But then when Moses talks to the people, he says, look, this isn't between you and me. This is between you and God. I'm not the one doing this. And so he says, when you're grumbling, by the way, it's God you're grumbling against. He's also the one that's going to provide you food. And therefore, you might need to think about this thing a little bit more. The word I write in my notes is oops, because when Moses says, God heard you grumbling, think about that. You know, God heard you. Yahweh heard you. That's kind of like saying, you know, the one that did all the plagues in Egypt, the one that parted the Red Sea, the one that is provided you with water, that's guiding you every single day through this pillar of cloud. He hears you, you know. This is not something that you want to have happen. You don't want God to hear you trashing him after all he's done for you. And it's true then and it's true now. And then it has that little aside where it says, Aaron looks out and sees the cloud, and it's like, uh-oh, yeah, he's here. He's in this room right now with me. He's in your room right there with you, and you don't want to hear God talking this way. Okay, so the next thing that happens is that God speaks up again, and he says, I've heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you'll eat meat, in the morning you'll be filled with bread, and then you'll know that I am Yahweh your God. So then at night, sure enough, they get quail, and quail just falls out of the sky. And so yay, we've got fresh bird to eat here, quail. And so probably tastes like chicken, like everything else, right? So then they've got that, and then they get stuff. There's dew on the ground the next morning. And when the dew dries up, there's this other stuff laying there, but they don't know what it is. So they say, what is this stuff? And then they say, I don't know. What is it? Well, we'll get to the, now I'll just do it now. The Hebrew word, you're going to learn a lot of Hebrew in this. The Hebrew word for what is it is manna, or what we say, manna. In other words, when we talk about manna from heaven, what we're really doing, we're speaking Hebrew, because it's the Hebrew word for whatchamacallit. Hey, what's this stuff? I don't know. Let's call it what is it, or whatchamacallit. So that's what they named it, because they didn't know what it was. So we shouldn't really say manna, we should say whatchamacallit. So there's whatchamacallit laying all over the ground. And this whatchamacallit is there, and God has already told them to gather as much as you need, right? But don't get enough. And so they get as much as they need. They all gather, and some people gather a whole lot, some people gather a little bit. And when they get back into the tent and start comparing what they've got, they all have the same amount. The people that worked really hard and got a lot, they have the same as the people that hardly did anything at all. Okay, that's weird. Because God was giving them just enough for each person for that day. And that's what he just said. That's what Moses just told him. It's what God just said, and Moses and Aaron just told the people. 1 day's supply. So they sit down, they eat that night. And what happens? Some of them think to themselves, you know, how often does quail and bread just fall from the sky? We better be smart about this thing and save a little extra so that, you know, just in case bread doesn't just magically fall from the sky tomorrow, we'll have something to eat. So sure enough, they save it, even though Moses has told them don't keep any until the morning. And the next morning, what happens to the ones that saved a little extra? There's maggots all in it, and it smells really bad. And what happens with Moses is Moses gets mad at them. All right, so every morning they got what they needed, and every day this happens except for Friday. And on Friday, they gather twice as much as they need, and then they're told absolutely keep a day's supply overnight. Well, this is kind of weird, because some of them have already had an experience with not doing this, but okay, so they save extra because Saturday is a Sabbath, or a day of rest. These are slaves. They've never had a day off in their lives. There's no such thing as weekends in these days. This is the invention of the weekend right here. Right this moment right here, before the Torah has come on Mount Sinai, before the Ten Commandments, before anything else, this is the invention of the weekend right here in your Bible. When they get 2 days worth of manna, and God says, and Saturday you're not supposed to go out and work. Well, sure enough, they get 2 days worth, and Saturday morning, what do? A bunch of them get up and go looking for manna again. Now Moses is getting pretty irritable with them because they're supposed to rest and not do anything, and they didn't trust. So you can see here, and then, God says this to them. God says, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that Yahweh has given you the Sabbath, and that's why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where he is on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. Now, this collection of whatchamacallit every day, and twice as much as you need on Friday, this takes place the whole time they're in the desert. Every single day, every week, this same series of events takes place. But this is the first time it takes place. And watch what God's doing. It uses language like God is testing them. But what's really happening is God is training these people to rely on him. You're going to get it 6 days a week, and on the 7th day you're not going to get any. And it's all going to be okay. And at first, no one trusts that because, you're not used to seeing bread just fall out of the sky. But after a while, what do you think happens? And so what God's doing is he's patiently training this grumbling, griping, whining bunch of people. Well, we're all the same. We're all grumbling, grinding, wiping people. Wiping. We're all grumbling, complaining people. And, what are you going to do? God is going to be patient with us up to a point. And now we're going to take a look at our third story. But first, I'm going to give you a quick break to look this over. here's our third story. Now, they're wandering around. We don't know how long later, weeks and weeks later, and we don't know where they are. I'm not going to spend any time going over place names in this study, by the way, because people don't really know where Mount Sinai was and all that kind of stuff. Just have a general idea. So we'll just leave it at that. Here they are wandering around, and they run out of water again. And so what do? They complain. They grumble again. And they gripe again. And they call out to Moses. And Moses talks to them, and God hears it and all of that. So here's basically what it says. Moses says, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put Yahweh to the test?" And the people grumbled and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make our children and livestock die of thirst?" Moses cries out to Yahweh, "What am I going to do with these guys? They want to stone me." And so Yahweh says this, "Walk on ahead of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock, strike the rock, water will come out of it for the people to drink." The people did that, and here's the thing. They named the place Massa and Meribah. Again, Hebrew words. Massa means testing, and Meribah means quarreling. So they named the place Testing and Quarreling because there the people tested and quarreled with God. This is an important little story because this story stands out as an example of what not to do. You'll find it throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament where people are reminded, don't be like they were at Massa and Meribah. Don't be like that. And the reason is because God wants us to learn from their mistakes. Remember we talked about this last time. God knew about us before these events took place, and He allowed these events to take place to teach us. Don't grumble and complain. Learn to trust God. He will take care of you. And don't be like these people and try Moses' patience and try God's patience. Well, these are fine stories, but I wonder if you're sitting there thinking what I usually do when I hear a story like this, and I think that, well, if it's well told, it's a good story. But who cares? I mean, so what? So what if a bunch of Israelites wandered around day after day, they got up, they went through the thing, blah, 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 blah. You know, what happened to the stuff about being unstuck? What happened to the part that has anything to do with me and my life? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is what it has to do with us. If you pay attention to what God does in this series of stories, in this series of events, God has first introduced Himself. Secondly, when they went through the Red Sea, He showed them with power who He